The wind howled through the cold, barren landscape. Snowflakes, sharp and biting, filled the air like a flurry of frozen daggers. It was a harsh world, one where survival was not guaranteed. The alien mother lay in the deep snow, her breath shallow and weak, her body shivering uncontrollably. She had fallen from the stars, her ship torn apart by a violent storm, her people's legacy scattered across the vastness of space. She was alone now, a stranger to this planet, fighting against the chill that seemed to seep into her very bones. Her species, born under the warmth of a distant sun, was not built to endure Earth's cold. Her skin, once tough and resilient, was now fragile, and her strength had drained away in the relentless frost. The crash had been violent. The ship had torn through the sky like a falling star, and she barely had time to prepare before everything around her turned to chaos. The world she had landed on was nothing like the one she knew. The planet was filled with dangerous wildlife, freezing winds, and an atmosphere that her body struggled to adapt to. Yet, her survival instinct was strong. Even when the cold numbed her limbs and her mind began to fog, she fought against it. She would survive. She had to. Her hands, now pale and stiff, gripped the icy ground, trying to push herself up. But the strength was gone. Her legs trembled beneath her, barely able to hold her weight. Each breath felt like a struggle, her chest tightening as the cold air pierced her lungs. She knew that if she didn't find shelter soon, she would not last much longer. With every movement, the snow piled higher around her, as though trying to bury her. Her vision blurred, her head spinning. There was a sharp pain in her side where the wreckage had struck her, but that was the least of her worries. She needed warmth, food, anything that might help her keep fighting against the cold. Her thoughts began to drift. She thought of her people, her family, her friends, lost in the depths of space. She was the last of her kind, the last to carry the memory of a dying world. It was her duty to survive, to find a new home for her people's future, but the strength to do so was slipping away with every passing second. She felt the weight of her loss pressing on her, pulling her further into despair. Just as her body was ready to give up, something unexpected happened. A faint sound reached her ears, muffled by the wind. It was a human voice, distant at first, but growing louder as it approached. Her mind, clouded with cold and pain, barely registered the presence of another. But her instincts, the same instincts that had kept her alive so far, told her to listen. A figure appeared in the distance, silhouetted against the stark white landscape. At first, she thought she was imagining things. The cold had begun to play tricks on her mind, but then the figure drew closer, and she saw him, a human. He was tall, dressed in heavy clothes, and seemed unaffected by the harsh conditions that had nearly defeated her. The human's gaze met hers, and for a moment, everything stood still. He seemed to hesitate, his expression filled with confusion and concern. He was a stranger, and she was a mystery to him. His eyes flicked to the wreckage of her ship, then back to her fragile form, sprawled in the snow. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice soft but laced with uncertainty. His accent was unfamiliar, his language strange, but his tone was gentle, full of concern. She couldn't answer. Her lips were numb, and the words stuck in her throat. The cold was winning. Her strength was gone, and she was barely conscious of the world around her. Yet, as the human moved closer, she felt a spark of hope flicker inside her. He knelt beside her, his hands reaching out to help her. She flinched at first, instinctively pulling back, afraid of what might happen. But he didn't seem dangerous. He was just a man, trying to help. His hands were warm, far warmer than hers, and the heat of his touch sent a rush of life through her freezing body. He wrapped his arms around her, lifting her carefully, his movements gentle but strong. She didn't resist. She couldn't. She had no strength left. He was her only hope now. "Hold on," he murmured. His voice was soothing, almost reassuring. "I'll get you somewhere safe." She felt herself being carried through the snow, each step more difficult than the last. But the human pressed on. She could barely keep her eyes open, but she knew this was her chance. Her only chance. The warmth from his body seeped into hers, and for the first time since the crash, she felt something other than cold. She didn't know who he was or where he had come from, but in that moment, he was he, our savior, a human. In the cold and the dark, a human was her warmth. As the storm raged on, they disappeared into the white expanse, the alien mother clinging to the last thread of hope that maybe, just maybe, she would survive this world after all. The snowstorm howled like a wild animal, tearing through the icy wilderness. The wind cut through the human's coat, chilling him to the bone. But he ignored it. His only focus was the alien woman in his arms. She was unlike anything he had ever seen. Her skin was a strange pale blue, like the color of the sky at dusk, and her features were delicate, almost ethereal. But her condition, her frailty, was all too familiar. She was suffering, fighting against a force of nature far beyond what she could withstand. His mind raced as he moved through the deep snow, the alien's body light in his arms. "Stay with me," he muttered under his breath, though he wasn't sure if she could hear him. Her eyes were closed, her face pale, her breath shallow. He had no idea who she was, where she came from, or what she was doing here. But one thing was certain: she needed help. The wind howled around them, and he squinted through the blizzard, trying to make out the distant outline of the cabin he had seen earlier. He had been hiking when the storm hit. The world had seemed peaceful, even beautiful at first, but now it was nothing but a dangerous, snow-covered trap. His compass had stopped working, and his phone had no signal. He had wandered further than he should have, only to find himself lost. But now, with this stranger in his arms, he realized his situation had become far more complicated. He had to get them both to shelter. He had to get her to safety. He hadn't fought twice when he had found her. She was lying in the snow, barely conscious, alone in the wilderness, as if the cold itself was going to claim her life. She had been so still, so broken, but when he reached her, something had made him act. He couldn't explain it. He wasn't a hero, not by any means, but something about her desperate, lost state, had awakened something in him. He couldn't just leave her there. "Stay with me," he repeated, though this time he wasn't sure if it was for her or for himself. His breath came in heavy, foggy clouds as he struggled forward, each step harder than the last. The snow was thick, the path disappearing with every gust of wind. He gritted his teeth and pushed on, carrying the alien woman through the blizzard, not knowing if he was walking toward safety or deeper into the storm. Minutes felt like hours. His muscles ached, his hands numbed from the cold, but still he moved. The shelter was close now. He could feel it. He had spotted it earlier when he was on his hike, a small cabin near a clearing. It was his only chance to save her, and he couldn't afford to fail. Not now. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, he saw the outline of the cabin. Relief flooded his chest, and he moved faster, the last of his energy pushed into his legs. He reached the door and kicked it open, grateful for the shelter it provided. He rushed inside, laying her down gently on the floor beside a stone fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The warmth inside the cabin was a welcome change, a stark contrast to the icy grip of the storm outside. He quickly moved to the fireplace, clearing out the ashes from the previous occupant. His hands worked quickly, though clumsily, as he gathered wood from a pile in the corner and stacked it carefully inside. He had no matches, no lighter, but he remembered the flint he had packed in his bag for emergencies. He scraped the flint against the stone, sparks flying as he tried to start the fire. It took several attempts, but finally, a small flame caught the dry wood. He added more kindling, watching as the fire grew. The warmth began to spread through the cabin, a small comfort against the raging storm outside. He turned to the alien woman. Her skin was still cold to the touch, but she was no longer shivering, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. Her eyes were closed, her face a mask of exhaustion. He knew she wasn't out of danger yet. Her body was too weak, and the cold had already taken a heavy toll. She needed warmth, food, and rest. He moved to her side, lifting her gently and placing her closer to the fire. He hesitated for a moment, unsure if she would react or even understand. But there was no time for hesitation. He removed her soaked outer layers, the cold clothing now heavy with snow, and draped a thick blanket over her. She was so still, so fragile, but there was a faint sign of life in her. Her breathing was steadier, and the color had slowly returned to her face. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, his shoulders sagging in relief. She was alive. She would make it. But questions lingered in his mind. Who was she? What was she doing here? Was she an alien? He had never seen anything like her before, and her ship, there had been no mistake. It wasn't from Earth. But there was no time to dwell on it. Not now. As he sat by the fire, watching over her, he knew he had done all he could for the moment. The storm would eventually pass, but the path ahead would be filled with uncertainty. The only thing he could be sure of was that he had chosen to help her, and that choice had already changed both of their lives. The fire crackled, its warmth filling the small cabin as the storm raged outside. The human man sat close to the hearth, his eyes never leaving the alien woman lying on the floor. Her breathing had steadied, and the pallor that once marked her skin was slowly fading, replaced by a soft flush of warmth. She had survived the worst of it, but he knew the danger wasn't over. She was still weak. Her body had been through far too much. He had done everything he could. The blanket was wrapped tightly around her, and the fire kept the cold at bay. The food he had found in the cabin was basic, some dried fruits and nuts, a few cans of soup. But it was nourishment, and that was enough for now. He had tried to feed her, gently encouraging her to take small bites. But she hadn't moved much, her eyes closed in a deep sleep. As the hours passed, he found himself growing more anxious. He needed answers. Who was she? Why had she come to Earth? And most importantly, where was she from? He had never seen anyone like her before. Her features were so delicate, her skin a strange shade of pale blue, unlike anything he could have imagined. Yet there was something about her, something that tugged at him, her quiet strength, the way she had endured the cold, even when it seemed she might give up. He glanced at her again. She had stirred, her fingers twitching slightly as if waking from a long, deep sleep. Her eyes flickered open, and for the first time, they met his. They were a soft, pale shade of violet, strange but beautiful, like nothing he had ever seen. "Where am I?" she whispered, her voice soft and fragile, like a gentle breeze. He sat up straighter, surprised by her sudden movement. "You're safe," he said, his voice low, trying not to startle her. "You're in a cabin. The storm was too much. I found you in the snow." He hesitated for a moment, then added, "I don't know what you are, but I couldn't leave you out there." Her eyes fluttered, and she tried to sit up, but the effort was too much. She slumped back against the blanket. "You helped me," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "Why?" He stared at her, unsure how to answer. I don't know," he replied truthfully. "I just couldn't let you die out there. It wasn't right." She looked up at him for a long moment, as if studying him. Her expression was unreadable. "You are human," she said, her voice soft but clear. "You don't fear me." He shook his head, feeling a small smile tug at his lips. "I've never been the type to fear what I don't understand." He leaned forward slightly, his eyes searching hers. "But you? I've never seen anyone like you before. Where do you come from?" For a long time, she didn't answer. The silence between them was thick, filled with the weight of unspoken questions. Finally, she closed her eyes, as though gathering her thoughts, and then spoke in a quiet, steady voice. "I come from far beyond your stars," she said, her words slow and deliberate. "My people are lost, My ship was destroyed. I am the last of my kind." The human's heart ached at her words. The sadness in her voice was palpable. He didn't fully understand what she meant, but the sorrow in her tone made it clear. Her story was one of loss, of survival against impossible odds. "You're the last?" he asked softly, his voice barely above a whisper. She nodded. "Yes. My home is no more. My species gone. I am alone in a world I do not know." He looked at her, his heart swelling with an emotion he couldn't fully explain. This alien, this being from the stars, was alone, just like him. In a way, they were both lost. And yet, here they were, two beings from different worlds, connected by a simple act of mercy. "Do you have a name?" he asked, suddenly realizing that he had never thought to ask before. She looked at him, her eyes still weary but sharp. "I do not know if you would understand my name. It is untranslatable." The human nodded slowly, accepting that her name might not make sense to him. He had no way of knowing what her world was like or how their languages worked, but that didn't matter to him. In that moment, he realized that it wasn't the name that mattered. It was who she was. A survivor, a mother, someone who had fought against the cold and the elements just to stay alive. "You can call me Lena," she said after a pause. "It is the closest sound in your language." Lena. The name felt strange on his tongue, but he knew it would be a name he would remember. "Well, Lena," he said with a small smile, "I'm glad you're awake, and I'm glad you're safe." She gave a small, almost imperceptible smile in return, though it was tinged with sadness. "Thank you, human," she said, her voice soft. "You gave me more than just warmth. You gave me mercy." The human sat back, a sense of peace washing over him. The fire crackled behind them, the storm still raging outside. But in that small cabin, surrounded by warmth and kindness, the world felt just a little bit smaller. Two beings from different worlds, brought together by chance, bound by the simple act of saving a life. Lena closed her eyes once again, her body still weak but comforted by the warmth surrounding her. The human washed over her, his heart full of unspoken promises. No matter where she came from, no matter how different their worlds were, he knew one thing for sure: he would protect her. She wasn't alone anymore. The days passed slowly, the storm outside relentless, but inside the small cabin, there was warmth. The fire crackled softly, providing the only comfort in the otherwise cold, desolate world. The human man, whose name she had learned was Ethan, spent each day tending to the fire, keeping the shelter in order, and making sure Lena had enough food and rest. Lena had begun to recover, though her body was still weak. She had remained mostly silent, only speaking when necessary. Her thoughts seemed to wander, and she would often look out the window, her violet eyes distant, lost in the cold, vast world beyond. Ethan noticed the change in her. The first few days, she had been only a shell of herself, exhausted, afraid, and uncertain. But now, there was a quiet strength returning to her. Her movements were slower, still careful, but there was something in the way she carried herself that showed she was regaining her resilience. One evening, as the fire's light flickered across the cabin, Ethan sat down beside her. She had been resting near the warmth of the hearth, wrapped tightly in the blanket he had found for her. She hadn't spoken much that day, but he had noticed her glancing at him now and then, as if considering something. "How do you feel?" he asked softly, his voice breaking the comfortable silence between them. Lena turned her gaze to him. Her eyes had a deep sadness in them, but there was also a spark, an unspoken understanding that passed between them. "I feel better," she said, her voice steady but tired. "But my body is not the only thing that needs healing." Ethan tilted his head, his curiosity piqued. "What do you mean?" Lena hesitated for a moment before answering, her gaze dropping to her hands, which were clasped tightly in her lap. "My people are gone. My world, my home is lost. I am the last. And that," She paused, looking out the window again, as if the wind outside carried the ghosts of her past. That is a wound that will never heal. Ethan sat quietly, letting her words sink in. He could feel the weight of her grief, though he couldn't fully understand the depth of it. How could he? His world had never been torn apart the way hers had. He had never lost everything: his home, his people, his very existence. "I can't imagine what you're feeling," Ethan said softly, his words genuine. "But you're not alone. You're here with me, and I'll help you however I can." Lena turned to look at him, her eyes searching his face as though looking for something. Maybe reassurance, maybe something deeper. She didn't speak immediately, but after a long pause, she nodded slowly. "You are kind," she said, her voice quiet, almost as if she were speaking to herself. "I did not expect kindness from humans." Ethan was taken aback by that. "Why not?" "Because," Lena trailed off, her eyes distant once again. "Because your kind are not known for mercy in our galaxy. My people had enemies. And the stories we heard of humans were not kind. They were harsh." She looked at him now, her gaze steady. "But you gave me warmth when I was cold. You gave me life when I was dying. And that is something no one else would have done." Ethan felt a lump form in his throat. He had never thought of himself as someone special. He was just a man, doing what anyone would do. But hearing her speak like that made him realize how deeply their paths had crossed. How much her survival meant, not just for her, but for him too. "I don't think it's about being kind or cruel," he said slowly. I think it's about doing what feels right when you see someone suffering. I couldn't leave you out there. I couldn't let you die alone." Lena nodded, her eyes softening. For a moment, they both sat in silence, the fire casting dancing shadows on the walls. The storm outside raged on, but inside the cabin there was a fragile peace, the kind of peace that came when two souls, though worlds apart, found a moment of understanding. As the days continued to pass, Ethan found himself learning more about Lena's world, though she spoke little of it. He didn't push her for answers, sensing that some things were too painful for her to speak of. Instead, they spent their time together in quiet companionship. He would go out to collect more firewood, and she would rest, growing stronger each day. When she was well enough, she helped him in small ways, tidying the cabin, washing the few scraps of clothing they had, and even helping him prepare the small meals they could make from the supplies left behind in the cabin. With each passing day, Ethan and Lena grew closer, their bond forming through the shared moments of survival. Though they came from different worlds, in this small cabin, under the harsh winter sky, they were just two beings trying to make it through, trying to find warmth in the cold. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Lena looked at Ethan with a soft smile. It was the first time he had seen her truly smile, not out of politeness or gratitude, but because, in that moment, she felt a flicker of peace. "Thank you, Ethan," she said quietly, "for everything." Ethan smiled back, feeling a warmth inside him that had nothing to do with the fire. "You don't have to thank me," he replied. "We're in this together." And for the first time in a long while, Lena allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could find a reason to hope again. The wind outside howled with a fury that seemed to shake the very foundation of the cabin. Snow lashed against the windows, covering the small house in a thick layer of white. It had been days since the storm had begun, and though the fire still burned brightly in the hearth, Ethan could feel the weight of isolation creeping in. Every gust of wind outside felt like a reminder that they were far from help, trapped in the heart of a harsh, unforgiving wilderness. Inside, Lena was resting, wrapped in the thick blanket. Her condition had improved over the past few days, but she was still fragile. Her body had endured so much. The crash, the cold, the loneliness. But there was something in her that refused to give up, and Ethan admired her for that. He had done what he could, gathered firewood, kept the fire burning, and shared the small supplies in the cabin. They had both been getting stronger, though the world outside was still as hostile as ever. Despite everything, there was a quiet peace between them now, a connection that had slowly built up over the past week. They no longer spoke only of survival. Sometimes, they sat in silence, each wrapped in their thoughts, yet completely aware of the other's presence. Tonight, however, something felt different. The storm outside was growing worse, and Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that it was a sign. A bad omen, perhaps. Something in the way the wind screamed through the trees sent an unsettling shiver down his spine. Lena stirred on the floor by the fire, her eyes fluttering open. She had been sleeping for hours, but the storm seemed to have disturbed her. She sat up slowly, her movements still stiff from the cold she had endured. She glanced at Ethan, her expression unreadable. "Ethan," she said softly, her voice laced with concern. "The storm, it's different tonight." Ethan looked toward the window, where the wind whipped the snow into a frenzy. He could feel the temperature drop, and there was an eerie stillness that followed the gusts. It was as if the storm had a mind of its own, and it was growing more violent. "I know," he replied quietly. "It feels worse than before. The wind's picking up. The cabin's holding up for now, but I don't know how much longer we'll be safe." Lena's gaze lingered on the door, then back at him. She looked tired, but her voice was steady. "We've already faced death once. If the storm grows worse, we may not survive another night." Ethan felt a pang of worry in his chest. He had been focused on keeping them both alive, keeping the cabin warm and safe, but the thought of losing her, losing the one person who had become so important to him in such a short time, filled him with dread. "I'm not going to let that happen," he said firmly, standing up and moving toward the window. The wind slammed against it, rattling the glass as if trying to break through. The snow outside had turned into a blizzard, thick and relentless, blocking out most of the world beyond the cabin. He had never seen a storm like this before. It was a force of nature, a reminder of how small and fragile they were. "We need to do something," Lena said, her voice calm despite the fear in her eyes. "The cabin won't hold up much longer. We need to find shelter elsewhere." Ethan turned to her in shock. "Where? There's nothing out there. It's a whiteout. We wouldn't last 5 minutes in that storm." Lena's expression softened, her gaze distant. "There is a place, not far from here, hidden in the mountains. It is an old cave, long forgotten. It might give us the shelter we need." Ethan stared at her, trying to understand. He had no idea where she was talking about, but the desperation in her voice was enough to make him believe her. "How do we get there?" he asked, his voice steady despite the storm's fury. "I know the way," she said. "I can guide you." The idea of leaving the cabin, leaving the warmth and safety they had worked so hard to create, was terrifying. But the storm was unlike anything he had ever witnessed, and deep down, he knew they couldn't stay in the cabin much longer. It was too dangerous. Ethan took a deep breath and nodded. "All right, let's do it." They gathered their things quickly. Lena helped him pack what little they had, including the few cans of food they had left and the blanket she had been wrapped in. Ethan added his own coat, though it was thin and not nearly enough to protect them from the storm's fury. The cold outside would be brutal, but they had no choice. With a final glance at the cabin, at the fire that had kept them warm, at the shelter they had built from nothing, they opened the door. The wind nearly knocked them back as they stepped outside. The snow whipped at their faces, blinding them as they trudged through the thick drifts. Lena led the way, moving with surprising confidence, despite the blizzard. Ethan followed closely behind, his steps heavy and slow, struggling against the wind. It was impossible to see much through the storm. He could barely make out the shape of Lena ahead of him, her outline barely visible in the swirling snow. They moved for what felt like hours, their progress slow and painful. The storm was unforgiving, pushing against them at every step. The cold cut into their skin, their faces raw and numb. Ethan could feel his body growing tired, but he pushed through. determined to make it to the cave. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Lena stopped. She turned to face him, her eyes bright despite the exhaustion on her face. "It's just ahead," she said, her voice barely audible over the roar of the storm. "We're almost there." Ethan looked ahead, seeing the faint outline of a rock formation. The cave. Shelter. They were so close. He reached out and grasped Lena's arm, his fingers stiff from the cold. "Let's go," he said, his voice strong. "We can make it." Together, they pushed forward, fighting against the storm with every step. The world around them was chaos, snow, wind, and freezing temperatures. But in that moment, they had each other. And as they approached the shelter of the cave, Ethan knew that they would survive this storm, just like they had survived everything else. The blizzard raged around them, howling like a wild animal, its cold claws reaching for any warmth it could find. Ethan's breath came in shallow, labored gasps, each exhale a cloud of mist in the frigid air. His body ached with exhaustion, and the weight of the storm pushed against him, but he refused to stop. Behind him, Lena moved with quiet determination, though her steps were slow and unsteady. She was still weak from the cold, but she was trying her best to keep up, to stay ahead of the storm's fury. They had reached the entrance of the cave just as the storm seemed to intensify. Snow piled up around them in thick layers, and the wind screamed through the narrow mountain pass. Ethan could barely see anything through the whiteout, but the faint outline of the cave's entrance was a beacon of hope. His muscles burned, his body screamed for rest, but they were so close. They had made it. With a final push, they reached the mouth of the cave, and Ethan hurried inside, his feet slipping on the icy ground. Lena followed him, her breath ragged and her face pale with the cold. The moment they stepped inside, the temperature dropped slightly, but it was still far warmer than the raging storm outside. The cave was a welcome shelter, though it wasn't much. There were no comforts, no warmth except what they brought with them. Still, it was shelter from the storm. Ethan sank down against the wall of the cave, his body trembling from exhaustion. He had to catch his breath, had to rest for just a moment before he did anything else. He glanced over at Lena, who had collapsed onto the rocky ground near the entrance. Her breathing was heavy, her chest rising and falling in shallow patterns. The cold had drained her more than he realized, and he knew that she wouldn't be able to survive if the storm didn't let up so. Quickly become dire, but as he sat there, listening to the wind howl outside, he couldn't help but feel a sense of peace. The immediate danger had passed. They were alive, and they had made it through. Lena stirred beside him, her violet eyes blinking open as the light from the fire danced across her face. She smiled faintly as she saw Ethan sitting next to her, his eyes still tired but filled with a quiet determination. "Good morning," she said softly, her voice hoarse from the cold, but still warm with gratitude. Ethan smiled back, though his lips were stiff from the cold. "Good morning. How do you feel?" Lena took a deep breath, stretching slowly as she sat up. Her body was still weak, but there was a strength in her now, a resilience that had been absent when they first met. "Better," she said, her voice steady. "The storm is still strong, but I can feel the warmth in my body again." Ethan nodded, relieved to see her recovering. He had feared that the cold would take more from her, but now, with the storm beginning to settle, he felt hopeful. "We'll make it through," he said. "We just have to wait until it's safe to move again." Lena glanced toward the entrance of the cave, her eyes thoughtful. "I know we have to wait, but I also know that we can't stay here forever. I have to get back to my people, to the stars. My people's legacy depends on it." Ethan looked at her with understanding. He had known, deep down, that her journey wasn't over. She wasn't just a survivor. She was carrying the weight of her entire species, a species that had vanished. "I know," he said softly, "but you don't have to do it alone. I'll help you." Lena turned her gaze to him, her eyes filled with something he couldn't quite place. "I didn't expect this," she said quietly. "When I first saw you, I thought you would only be a brief moment in my life, a fleeting chance of survival. But now, I feel like we are connected. You have given me more than just warmth. You have given me a reason to keep fighting." Ethan's heart tightened in his chest. He had never thought of himself as a hero. He was just a man who had seen someone in need and done what he could. But hearing Lena speak like that made him realize how much he had come to care for her, how much her survival had come to mean to him. "You've given me a reason too," Ethan said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "You're not just some stranger to me. You're someone I want to protect. Someone who matters." Lena's lips parted as though she was about to say something, but before she could speak, there was a sound, a soft thud from outside the cave. Both of them froze, their senses alert. The storm had been loud, but now the cave seemed strangely quiet. Ethan stood up slowly, careful not to make a sound, and moved cautiously toward the entrance. He peered out, squinting into the swirling snow. There was nothing there, just the endless white of the storm. "Did you hear that?" Ethan whispered. Lena nodded, her eyes narrowing. "Yes, I did." They both listened for a moment, their senses heightened by the tension in the air. The sound came again, a soft thud, like something was moving in the snow outside. Ethan's heart began to race. Was it another person? Another being? Or was it something far worse? Ethan didn't hesitate. "Stay here," he said firmly. "I'll go check it out." Lena looked at him, her eyes filled with concern. "Be careful." Ethan nodded, then moved swiftly to the entrance. The wind howled as he stepped outside, the snow so thick that he could barely see his own hand in front of him. His eyes scanned the horizon, but there was no sign of anything moving. And then, from behind him, he heard a voice, a familiar voice. "Ethan." He spun around, his heart pounding in his chest, to find Lena standing behind him. She had followed him out into the storm, her face determined despite the cold. "I'm coming with you," she said, her voice strong. "We are in this together. You're not alone." Ethan stared at her for a long moment, a mix of surprise and admiration in his eyes. She was right. They had made it this far together. There was no turning back now. Lena stepped forward, her hand reaching out to him. Ethan took it without hesitation, their fingers entwining as they faced the storm together. "I'll always be here," Lena said softly, her voice filled with conviction. "As long as you're willing to stand by me, I will never give up." Ethan squeezed her hand, his heart full. They had both faced death in the cold, but they had come through it, together. The storm was still fierce, but it no longer felt like an enemy. It was just another challenge they would face together. And whatever came next, they would face it as one.